First of all, a warm welcome to Professor Michael Cronin, joining us from Dublin today. So thank you very much, first of all. E grazie anche a tutte le colleghe e i colleghi che ci stanno raggiungendo, ci hanno già raggiunto, sia da Genova che da altre località. Mi fa piacere salutare Loredana Polezzi, che è stata già nostra ospite in un'altra serie di incontri e seminari 2 anni fa. Questa serie di eventi, nata sotto Covid, in realtà ha proseguito con grande vivacità e successo. E per una volta forse l'aspetto digitale che abbiamo forzatamente abbracciato ci ha facilitato nel raggiungerci vicendevolmente across borders, no? E questo tutto sommato è un aspetto positivo che mi piace sottolineare, anche perché le condizioni in cui viviamo sono sempre più restrittive, sempre più diciamo nutrono la tensione invece di nutrire sentimenti insomma più interessanti, più vivaci, più fertili per il confronto. So I'm very pleased, really pleased and grateful to Professor Michael Cronin to be with us today. It's not only a great pleasure for a scholar, an academic that has been extensively publishing in translation studies, but also in culture, language, and also travel, literature, and various aspects of translation studies. It's also a great pleasure for me to welcome a person that I've never met in person. So, and I was quickly answering my invitation and was promptly having a sort of very nice and quick exchange. So Professor, let me introduce him. I mean, probably many of you have either read some of his work or his books, but let me introduce him briefly. I will switch from English to Italian through this introduction to make sure that everyone is on the same page, so to speak. Farò un po' di salti dall'inglese all'italiano per favorire, diciamo, un po' l'apertura di queste nostre 2 ore insieme in questo appuntamento dedicato all'Anthropocene. È il 4º appuntamento di questa serie di incontri. E io sono molto grata al professor Cronin per aver accettato. Non ci siamo mai conosciuti di persona, ma è stato uno scambio estremamente fertile, proficuo e molto rapido. Farò una breve introduzione del professor Cronin, ma immagino molti di voi conoscano la sua produzione accademica, i suoi scritti in vari ambiti. Mi fa piacere introdurlo, and I will switch to English again. So Michael Cronin is professor of French, and this is a chair that has been there since 1776, so almost 3 centuries away, and is also director of the Center for Literary and Cultural Translation in Trinity College, Dublin. Among his publications, I will only probably mention a few, and mainly around translation and travel literature. In 2012, The Expanding Word Towards Politics of Microspection. In 2013, Translation in the Digital Age. And in 2017, Translation and Ecology in the Age of the Anthropocene. And then Irish and Ecology in 2019. And most recently, the latest book, or most recent book, Eco-Travel, Journeying in the Age of the Anthropocene. So I will cut this short, and thank you everyone for joining us, and a very warm welcome to Michael Cronin. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Grazie mille, Laura, e benvenuti a tutti. It's a particular pleasure for me to address this gathering, particularly since I know that you come from a lot of different disciplinary backgrounds. So it's particularly interesting for me to, if you like, present some of these ideas, which, if you like, are drawn from the field of translation studies, but where I hope to kind of enter a wider dialogue with colleagues that come from many, many different backgrounds, partly because one of the things that I would like to argue is that the notion of translation is fairly fundamental to how we need to rethink or reconceptualize the notion of what constitutes the humanities in the age of the Anthropocene. I wanted to begin with Bruno Latour and his Facing Gaia, a series of lectures that he gave in Edinburgh a number of years ago. And he notes that the designation of a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, serves to mark climate change, not just as a kind of a transitory event, a sort of a passing crisis, but rather as a profound mutation in our relation to the world. In other words, what place do humans now occupy in the world? And in turn, how do they relate to the other organisms and entities with whom they share the planet? So the climate crisis has fundamentally challenged the doctrine of human exceptionalism. This is a theme that you've heard in a number of seminars so far, whereby, if you like, this kind of idea that humans are masters and possessors of the natural world and thus uniquely equipped to subordinate it to their own needs. Rather than asserting human supremacy and autonomy, what the climate crisis has revealed is human vulnerability and dependency. So the Anthropocene is not just a geophysical event, but necessitates a profound cultural paradigm shift affecting all areas of human inquiry. As Gemma Deer observes in Radical Animism, reading For the End of the World, she says, just as the Copernican revolution did, a radical transformation of thinking is needed that changes not just what is observed, but the point of view from which any observation is made. When we move from a geocentric to a heliocentric view of the universe, it's not just the things that we're looking at, but the place that we're looking at it from begin to change in particular ways. One of my arguments is that one of the places that we can begin to look at things from afresh or anew is the area of translation. So how might translation studies inform this change, not only in what is observed, but in the point of view from which observations are made? In order to begin to answer this question, I want to posit two different modes of envisaging environmental catastrophe, namely what I'm going to call the eco-major mode and the eco-minor mode. The eco-major mode is the articulation of the climate crisis through the prism of events or forces that significantly exceed human scales of apprehension or intervention. The eco-minor mode, on the other hand, is a representation of the crisis through the agency of events or forces or entities occurring at human or infra-human scales. The eco-major mode is the dominant paradigm for representing environmental crises and is illustrated by a film, Gorgo, came out in 1961, a film directed in English by the French film director Eugène Laurier. I'll just give you a taste of what this film is like. If I can get my screen to work here.
No motion picture of our time has ever unleashed sharp spectacle of such scope and realism as up from the depths of prehistoric mystery rages Virgo. The headlines of the world blaze the fabulous story of this monster from another age, catapulted from some vast sub-ocean cavern by unprecedented volcanic action. And the headlines scream the story of the reckless skin divers who captured the monster and put it on exhibition.
I'm not sure the images are showing. Riuscite a vedere il video?
No, non si vede.
The headlines do not record the story of a little boy who had a curious sympathy.
Michael, I think the video is not showing.
What strange secret does he know that scientists only suspect?
You're trying to say there may be a fully grown one of these things around somewhere?
Okay, so you couldn't see that, no? No. Okay.
I don't think so. I couldn't see the video. I don't know whether my colleagues could. Anyone could see the video? Vedevate il video?
No, Laura.
No. Okay. Well,
No.
let me describe then the video for everybody. So it's a film that came out in 1961, and basically you have kind of two unscrupulous treasure hunters, Joe Ryan and Sam Slade, who go ashore on Nara, an island off the west coast of Ireland, after this kind of mysterious underwater disturbance damages their ship. The Irish Gaelic-speaking islanders are presented as hostile and unwelcoming, refusing to translate what they say into English. Joe at one point says of their speech, "It doesn't sound like welcome in any language." So despite stumbling into a fractious translation zone, Ryan and Slade make good their escape and later capture a 65-foot prehistoric animal, which they sell to a circus at the Battersea Fun Fair in London. Reports soon arrive, however, of a 200-foot creature, mother of the captured animal, on her way to London to recover her offspring. So we see her giant figure crushing the buildings and destroying the bridges of the capital, the streets crammed with terrified Londoners. The British Army and Navy are mobilized to stop her in her tracks, but their combined military efforts and 4 million volts of electricity administered to the hapless parent end in failure. Mother and child are reunited, and they return from whence they came, the sea. So it's, if you like, a kind of a film that prefigures a lot of later films, such as sort of Godzilla, where you have these kind of giant creatures that stalk across urban centers. So the ecologically destructive practices of Ryan and Slade in an island community speaking a minority language turns this translation zone, what Emily Apter has defined as sites that are in translation belong to no single discrete language or single medium of communication. So it's changing it, if you like, from their arrival changes from a translation zone to what Naomi Klein has called a sacrifice zone. She defines sacrifice zones as poor places, out of the way places, places where residents lack political power, usually having to do with some combination of race, language, and class. And the
Sorry,
people,
Michael.
sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but I think you're not sharing anymore.
Okay. Let's, is that working now?
It is. It is.
Okay. So
Thank
this,
you.
yeah, the translation zone that I referred to earlier, that from Emily Apter's book, and this is where Naomi Klein defines sacrifice zones. So sacrifice zones are areas where political, linguistic, and racial marginality converge to make resistance to resource predation even more problematic. As remaining scarce metals, mineral deposits, gas fields are often found in remote or sparsely populated regions, the long-term interests of the inhabitants and their ecosystems are sacrificed to the short-term gains of the extraction industries. This is not to say that translation zones are only found on the margins. As I'll explain later, cities can also equally function as complex ecological translation zones. Indeed, if the origins of the environmental crisis are in out-of-the-way places like the island of Nara, the dramatic large-scale consequences play out in the iconic urban hearts of former empires. This then is the eco-major mode, the equating of environmental catastrophe with the gargantuan, the terrifying, the overwhelming. So the images of the disintegrating icebergs, the raging forest fires, the violent storms. Gorgo is to all intents and purposes in the eco-major mode, Gaia on the rampage. The eco-minor mode, on the other hand, describes the nature of the most recent environmental catastrophe to affect us, the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic was, of course, a reflection of the wider environmental crisis, more symptom than outlier. As the noted historian of epidemics, Frank M. Snowden, points out, each age gets the pandemic it deserves. COVID-19 flared up and spread because it suited the society we've made, a world with nearly 8 billion people, the majority of whom live in densely crowded cities, and are all linked by rapid air travel, which create innumerable opportunities for pulmonary viruses. At the same time, demographic increase and frenetic urbanization lead to the invasion and destruction of animal habitat, altering the relationship of humans to the animal world, end of quote. So the ecological disruption, this zoonotic transmission, that was the necessary context for the pandemic, was magnified in its effects on human societies by the globalizing effect of human displacement, of which translation is both cause and effect. There is no such thing as globalization without translation. The very notion of the expansion of economic activities outside points of origin, Starbucks, Coke, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, is only possible or conceivable or practical in any way with the assistance of and consistent practice of translation. Otherwise, the activities don't happen, the services do not get sold, the income does not come in. So the source of global disruption and death in the eco-minor mode is not a towering amphibian monster or a giant forest fire, but a microorganism. The streets were not filled with scurrying humans, but emptied out by lockdowns and curfews. The pandemic was a cataclysm of subtraction, not addition. Representing environmental crisis in the eco-major mode is more habitual than in the eco-minor mode, as is borne out, for example, in many of the grim scenarios described by David Wallace Wells in his book, The Uninhabitable Earth. It can be argued, of course, that a tendency to dwell on the eco-major mode is a way of galvanizing people into action around the climate emergency. But one could also argue that it dangerously neglects the insights that are offered by the eco-minor mode. Scaling up our fears means scaling back our attention. What I want to suggest today is that using the prism of the minor in the context of translation and ecology means opening up paths of inquiry which make translation more immediately relevant to wider societal questions in the age of the Anthropocene. Minoritarian thinking is all the more pertinent in that both environmental issues and translations have had a long experience, until very recently, of being largely minoritized in the public discourse and the academy. In the case of ecology, the formulation of a notion of minority is related to the way in which particular binaries have been constructed in the Western tradition. The Australian feminist and eco-philosopher Val Plumwood sees a culture-nature dualism in majoritarian forms of Western thinking as a binary that radically separates reason, mind, and consciousness from what she calls the lower order that comprises the body, the woman, the animal, and the pre-human. As for translation, Lawrence Venuti notes in his Contra-Instrumentalism that, and I quote, the arts and human sciences depend on translation for their invention, accumulation, and dissemination of forms and ideas. Nonetheless, translation remains grossly misunderstood, ruthlessly exploited, and blindly stigmatized, end of quote. In order to clarify what the minor mode might bring to our thinking about translation and society from an ecological perspective, I want to examine two kinds of minority position. What I'm going to call a relational minority, which is largely to do with the question of agency, and a situational minority, which is largely concerned with the notion of place. Raimundo Isidro Alaves, a translator from Spanish into the indigenous minority language of Mexico called Ñeñu, writes about the particular import of translating into an indigenous language. In our case, the Ñeñu language transports readers into another reality, using its own words to name the flora, fauna, and life forces, as in other indigenous languages throughout the world. Those objects and organisms will live on indefinitely as they're part of the community's identity. So Alaves presents translation not so much as an activity that creates connections between a major language, Spanish, and a minor one, the Ñeñu, but as an activity that establishes new forms of environmental relationality for readers of the translation. Reading the Henyenu text makes the flora, fauna, and other constituent elements of the living world present in a way that is otherwise obscured. This is not simply an exercise in raising environmental consciousness on the synchronic plane. It also has a diachronic dimension. He talks about those objects and organisms will live on indefinitely as they're part of the community's identity. As, if you like, the written trace of the translations into Henyenu and translations in other indigenous languages carry the languages across space and time into the future beyond the current lifetime of the elders. So central to Alabe's conception of indigenous translation practices is that it is as much a matter of worlds as of words. He sees his translation activity as opening up forms of interaction with the non-human that literally brings the words on the page to life. The term he uses translation is life forces. These life forces are understood as a form of expressive vitality common to the human and the non-human. Translating into the minor language is the relational minority in practice, the multiplication of forms of relationality in major minor encounters. In advocating for more than human histories, Emily O'Gorman and Andreas Gaynor claim that the more than human is not a synonym for nature or the non-human, but rather a term that highlights the primacy of relations over entities. The basic principle here is that co-constitution, that organisms, elements, and forces cannot be considered in isolation, but must always be considered in relation. Of course, this is a point that's been made repeatedly by practitioners and theorists of ecological materialism. There is no external nature or environment with which humans interact. They are always already involved in the more than human. The goal is not to demonstrate that the natural is really cultural or to reassert a biophysical reality, but to recognize the full range of participants in the more than human world of multi-species coexistence and non-human entanglements. This is precisely the thrust of the indigenous translation practice articulated by Alabes. The act of translation into a minoritized language makes the reader more intensely aware of the premise that for the Nenu, to name objects and organisms is to breathe life into what had been rendered inert by the major language. More broadly, these translation practices illuminate the necessity of rethinking translation in the light of the relational ontology advocated by O'Gorman and Gaynor. What this version of translation might look like is hinted at by Timo Maran in his elaboration of the concept of eco-semiosphere. Maran makes the claim that the difference between alienated and ecological culture appears to lie in the question of the extent to which human culture engages in semiotic contacts or dialogues with non-human species and natural environment. In this context, he argues that semiotics needs to move beyond, and I quote, a viewpoint focusing on closed human cultural and linguistic ecosystems, and a shift to an open perspective wherein human culture is seen as situated amongst the symbiosis and communication of other species. And of course, this argument has been articulated again more recently by Cobus Mare in his biosemiotic theory of translation. So building on a notion that was first articulated by the American medievalist Paul Alfred de Suez, Maran defines the eco-semisphere as follows. A semiotic system that comprises all species with their umwelts and the diverse semiotic relations, including humans and their culture, that they have in the given ecosystem, as well as the material support structures that enable the eco-semiosphere to thrive. So it gives as an example of the eco-semiosphere the coastal meadows to be found in the Baltics, Scandinavia, and the United Kingdom. And these meadows emerge from a complex interaction between different physical, biological, and human cultural factors, such as winds, floods, species populations, and the acts of grazing and haymaking. Maran sketches out the different parts of these ecological sites. They're open to external influences while being at the same time a unique habitat for saline-tolerant plants and coastal bird species. Through the co-effects of physical and living factors, the coastal meadows are also conditions of the specific ecological codes we find there. The high calls of gulls and waders overcome the noise of waves and wind that mask the lower pitches. Human culture is involved in coastal meadows through traditional and modern farming and fishing, nature tourism and holiday houses, conservation initiatives, and various forms of monetary assistance. So central to this expanded notion of the semiosphere, which for Yuri Lotman, the Russian-Estonian semiotician, included various forms of human semiotic interaction, is what I have defined elsewhere as the tradosphere, and which I would define as the sum of all translation systems on the planet, all the ways in which information circulates between living and non-living organisms, and is translated into a language or code that can be processed or understood by the receiving entity. In other words, what points to a move beyond what Maran terms as alienated culture is the extent to which human culture engages in semiotic contacts or dialogues with non-human species and natural environments. And this is what guides, if you like, the Peñeño translation practice as summarized by Raimundo Isidro Alaves. The desire for this contact, the establishment of this dialogue. In a similar way, the Irish writer and journalist Manchán Magan, moving into the minorized indigenous world of Irish Gaelic. For him, this means that a world of particulars opens up, revealing specific human, non-human interactions. At one point, he's talking about his different words for a field in Irish Gaelic. So a gabhar is a field of corn grass, bjorch is a marshy field, bdanar is a fallow field, cuividin is a tilled field worked in partnership with a neighbor, tuairt a night field for cattle, clun is a meadow field between two words, tauch an arable field in an arid area. Translating into the minor reveals a relationality that is otherwise obscured. It's obscured, if you like, by that word field in English. This relationality is not, however, straightforwardly communicative. It is translational. The physical, biological, and human cultural factors present in the coastal meadows do not share a common language. A contact or dialogue means communication across radical forms of difference, a liminal encounter with alternate epistemes and ontologies. When the natural world, other species and indigenous peoples have been minoritized by dominant forms of exploitative extractivism, the translational challenge of difference is compounded by the political challenge of inequality. One response to the complex nature of epistemic, ontological, and political relationality is to advocate for an explicit form of untranslatability. The notion of untranslatability surfaces in Edna Andrews' engagement with Yuri Lockman's notion of the semiosphere, when she comments, the languages of the semiosphere run along a continuum that includes the extremes of total mutual translatability and complete mutual untranslatability. So, if Lockman's analysis is primarily concerned with human semiosis, the potential for the untranslatable would appear to increase exponentially as we move into the realm of the more than human, minimizing the relevance of translation to any formulation of relational minority. And this indeed would appear to be the implication of the argument advanced by Patricia McCormack in her A Human Manifesto, that we can never know the more than human, and that for the more than human, it is better this way. Speaking on behalf of abolitionists who advocate that the gradual disappearance of the human species is the only plausible solution to the climate crisis, McCormack argues abolitionists are activists against all uses of animals, acknowledging that communication is fatally human. So we can never know modes of non-human communication, and to do so is both hubris and materially detrimental to non-humans. The difficulty with this standpoint is the suggestion that exploitation has a monopoly on relationality, that the only way to go beyond alienation is to further alienate. In a sense, the declared impossibility or undesirability of translation in the eco-semiosphere raises the same issues as those addressed in Lawrence Venuti's critique of the notion of untranslatability as advanced by translation theorists such as Emily Apter and the French scholar Barbara Gastin. Venuti argues that to promote a notion of untranslatability so as to stigmatize and rule out the study of translation in its many forms, humanistic, pragmatic, and technical, as well as the institutional and economic conditions in which it is practiced, any such exclusion is effectively to abdicate the status quo by withdrawing from the areas where social struggles can occur. So in other words, the ever-present danger in the notion of the untranslatable is that translation gets essentialized as a process which either does, translatable, or does not, untranslatable, happen. So rather than seeing translation as a horizon of expectation, which is endlessly negotiated and renegotiated through the engagement with the institutional and economic conditions of its possibility, the untranslatable can nourish fantasies of virtuous isolation that paradoxically replicate the sovereign indifference of human exceptionalism. Denying relationality in the name of diversity is effectively to eliminate that diversity. Translation, as understood in the context of relational minority practices, is about the amplification of differences, cultural, historical, the multiplication of particulars, linguistic, stylistic, not their removal. Legitimate concerns around anthropomorphism or political manipulation through assimilation end up in a perverse way strengthening the status quo. The refusal to countenance the emancipatory possibilities of translation through its complex involvement at the most detailed levels with difference is effectively to promote closure as a virtue and openness as a form of culpable weakness. When Raimundo Isidro Alabes defends his translation practice, he presents it as an act of living engagement, a gesture of political defiance. When we do, and I quote, when we do not hold on to our indigenous languages, we dissipate the possibility of reflecting our place in the landscape, shroud the surrounding context, and close a door to the undying. End of quote. What Alabes is suggesting is a way of understanding human, more than human relations, which move beyond the exhausted tropes of human exceptionalism and anthropomorphism. When Alabes and McGann present the process of language shift to the minor as an act of reanimating the world, of opening the door to the undying, they are demonstrating how these languages interact with the more than human to engage with the world in all its particulars. When Alabes claims, for example, that translation involves, I quote, pushing the language even further to come up with original expressions, he's not only describing, if you like, the challenge of coining new terms in his language for Spanish words or concepts, but also the pressure placed on human signifying practices by the presence of, and I quote, beings of all kinds in their world. As illustrated by McGann's multiplying fields in Irish Gaelic, the human as translator has to consistently find, I quote, original expressions to describe a context human and more than human, which is constantly evolving. It is in this connection, I think, that we can situate Cobus Mare's theory of biosemiotic translation, which seeks to move beyond what he calls the I-idolatry of consumerist individualism. I wonder whether we do not need to be liberated from being constructors of the universe to being co-constructed by innumerable other agents, such as people, animals, plants, bacteria, energy, matter, and laws of the universe. Of course, the idea of considering an idea of relationality involves looking not only at who is doing the relating, but also where the relating is being done, the specific situatedness of the relationality. Before looking at another instance of minoritized translation practice, I want to briefly examine a minoritized epistemic approach to knowledge and its implications for thinking about translation and situatedness. If many indigenous minoritized cosmologies are primarily focused on the world outdoors, the history of industrialized modernity is largely about staying indoors. As the French writer and activist Pierre Rabhi has pointed out, talking about humans and their experience of modernities. He says humans from preschool to university are kept inside. Later, these humans, of course, go to work in office blocks or government buildings. Leaving these buildings, they get into cars that prolong this isolation from the world beyond the wind screen. And at night, they look out at that world from behind another screen, the television, the laptop, the tablet. The essayist Chris Arthur claims that millions of us have become more defined by the time we spend indoors than outside. As a result, we've lost touch with the natural world. Those with the most pronounced indoor sensibilities can't identify even the commonest species of birds, insects, and plants in their locality. So this kind of physical enclosure is paralleled by a philosophical closure. The natural world becomes a remote abstraction, more a matter of occasional concern than that of regular comment. What if we were to reframe this critique then in terms of translation and thinking about ecological situationists? Is there a sense in which we have vastly overvalued the importance of translating indoors at the expense of translating outdoors? The iconography, the representation, the visual representations of translation in the Western tradition suggests, in fact, what I would argue is a fundamental tension between translation within and translation without. In two near contemporary works of art, we find these competing representations of translation activity. Der heilige Hieronymus in Geheus, Saint Jerome in his study, is a copper engraving by Albrecht Dürer from 1514. So as the title suggests, as you can see here on the slide, it depicts the translator of Vulgate, fully clothed at his desk, laboring over the translation. There are tables, chairs, cushions, books, as well as a lectern, hourglass, quill, inkpot, in short, all the material accoutrements of the closeted scholar at his work on his opus. A world beyond the study is suggested by the light streaming through the large casement window to the side of the translator's desk. A sleeping dog and a domesticated lion in the foreground also point to a reality originating outside the study. Der heilige Hieronymus in Felsige Landschaft, St. Jerome in Rocky Landscape, is a painting that Lucas Cranach the Elder produced on the limewood panel sometime between 1515 and 1520, so around the same time as Dürer's engraving. In this interpretation, the renowned translator is half naked. His desk and seat made out of roughly hewn wood and stone. Rocks and trees tower over him, and the surrounding vegetation appears to be slowly engulfing the church father. The partially concealed line, now standing and alert, is at a far remove from his indoor counterpart. If the natural world is a mediated afterthought in Dürer's engraving, it is overwhelmingly present in Cranach's painting. There is a vulnerability in Jerome's nakedness, a vivid sense of his coexistence in the more than human world that recalibrates his translation activity, or more specifically, invites us to think about what it might mean to translate outdoors, to situate oneself differently. The two radically contrasting images then of Jerome, translating indoors and outdoors, that run right through the iconography of the saint in the Western tradition, begs the question as to why so little thought has been given to this duality from a translation perspective. Has thinking about translating outdoors become as minoritized as thinking outdoors itself? Translating outdoors is not a literal act. It is not having Jerome bring his laptop or tablet outside into the wilderness. It is primarily about developing a sensitivity to the more than human world, which is rooted in the many languages that have been used to describe that world. Writing about literary translation into the indigenous languages of the Americas, The poet and translator Enrique Bervin Herrera claims that, I quote, indigenous languages contain a bewildering abundance of terms regarding their geographical habitat. However, it's not just simply a question of the rich lexical mappings of terrains that are obscured by, if you like, the blandscapes of monolingualism. There is also the question of the broader attentiveness to the linguistic shaping of the environmental contexts in which humans are situated. In her discussion of what she calls Anishinaabe translation studies, Margaret A. Newton states that in translation, relation is everything. In Anishinaabe, the language that is used by the Anishinaabe people that she is describing or talking about, the word that is used for translation is Anakanatun, which suggests the idea of things being strung together or of extending something by tying pieces together. But there's also an echo of another word, Anikadwajan, which is the notion of an ancestor or a great grandparent. And she says, perhaps the best way to understand both translation and ancestry is through the action of connection. As we translate, we connect languages and cultures. Our language also connects us to those who used it before and those who will carry it into the future. In terms of situational minority, the indigenous perspective on the capacity of language and other signifying systems to situate or place its speakers in the more than human world, the concept of translation, of course, is not wholly innocent or neutral. One of the points, for example, that Newton makes is that in the past, many translations of Native American, Aboriginal, and American Indian literatures have been the work of ethnographers and documentary linguists. And the function of these translations has been to reveal the maximum amount of information to the English reader or to recover and reactivate linguistic artifacts from dormancy. In this new generation of translation, the directional change from English to Anishinaabe is intended not to reveal one culture to another, but rather to connect one culture to itself across multiple languages. So basically what she is articulating here is the notion that what characterized a particular approach to translation, particularly but not only with respect to indigenous peoples, was an instrumentalist notion of translation, the notion that basically meanings could be transferred intact from one language to another. It was just a particular way, it was a matter of working out the best or most effective way of doing this to kind of extract instrumentally a semantic essence, which would then be transferred to the target language. And of course, this instrumentalist approach to translation, which is still very, very much with us and which has been heavily critiqued by people like Lawrence Venuti, is very much aligns itself with the notion of resource extractivism, that just as you extract mineral material resources, you extract a particular kind of semantic resource from the language. Whereas what she is opposing to this is a notion or we're going to pose this, is a notion of indigenous hermeneutics, which is the idea that what translation is about is not the extraction of single essential meanings, but about, if you like, a productive creative process that leads to the a plurality, to the amplification, the pluralization of meanings, and in this way aligns itself with a particular vision of restorative ecology, which tries to repair the damage that has been done to landscapes or places in the way that particular kinds of instrumental forms of translation have done a great deal of damage to indigenous languages and cultures. I want just to finish by going back to the eco major and the figure of Gorgo. At the very end of this film, we see this image of the creature sort of going back to the sea, and we get this voiceover, and the voiceover says, "A great city overwhelmed, exhausted, lies helpless under the immeasurable power and ferocity of this towering apparition from before the dawn of history. And yet, as though disdaining of the pygmies under her feet, she turns back, turns with her young, leaving the prostrate city, leaving the haunts of man, and leaving man himself to ponder the proud boast, he alone is Lord of all creation." You're going back now, back to the sea. So you could say at one level that what we have here in this 1961 film is a kind of a proto-ecological manifesto, a kind of an intuition of the imminent collapse of a notion of human exceptionalism. What we can also, I think, see in that notion of the creature going back into the sea, a particular kind of representation of what it is about translation itself, which is often seen, as often depicted, as a form of bridge building, building the bridge between cultures, between communities, between languages. This is what it seems to me is a kind of a pontifical image of translation. The pontiff, the Pope, is the pontifex, the bridge builder. And the image that it seems to me is more appropriate is not so much the bridge over the river as the river itself, as the water, as the sea that Gorgo goes into. That what characterizes, if you like, translation is more the way in which it moves constantly from one bank to the other, from one language to the other, from one culture to the other. And this more the view from down below in the waters than from up above in the bridge. And this notion, if you like, of a fluid, immersive translation is something that I would argue is more useful and more practical in terms of how we engage or think about notions of relational ontology in the age of the Anthropocene. So I realized that I've long since run out of time, so I think I'll stop there. I apologize for the technical problems there at the beginning of the presentation, and hope they didn't obscure the meaning too much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your very interesting and intriguing talk. No, I think the technical issues were only minor. In fact, within your major and minor dichotomy here. So I welcome any question, comment, afterthought from colleagues and the audience in general. Loredana.
Sorry, I was just manifesting the fact that I'm here rather than wanting to ask a question as such. But if you want, I'll start. Yes, Michael, thank you as always. It's inspiring to listen to you. I want to ask a question which is asked in the spirit of being devil's advocate, and it's about the relationship of minoritization and relational minority and minoritizing thought with indigeneity. And I'm always slightly disquieted, if that is a word, by that. And what I wanted to ask you in a sense is, what is the essential element here? Is the kind of translation that you were describing in relation to relational minority different because of its minoritized position? Is it different because of its indigeneity? And if it is its indigeneity, what is it in that makes it different? I'm slightly worried about a kind of re-romanticization of the notion of indigeneity somehow in yeah. And as I said, it's asked in the spirit of being a devil's advocate.
No, I think that's a very, very important question, and one that demands a kind of clarification that you're looking for. One thing that's haunted depictions of indigeneity and indigenous cultures and so on is, of course, the terrible trope of the romantic savage, the noble savage, the kind of the idealization of people in indigenous settings, and a kind of pre-lapsarian purity, whatever, or harmony that their world represents. And of course, there was very, very kind of strong kickback, a pushback against that, particularly I think by a lot of colonial and sort of anti-colonial and post-colonial theorists. I think, however, the two things have happened though as a result of that, and this is where I'm kind of a post-colonizing thing, is that in their kind of desire to kind of demythify and demystify that kind of romanticization of people in different settings that were considered to be kind of pre-modern, anti-modern, and so on, is that curiously it led to a refusal or an unwillingness to acknowledge the very real forms of environmental relationality that existed, and which time and time again, and you see this particularly, I think, in the case of Caribbean theorists, but you can also see it in the case of certain theorists in sub-Saharan Africa, is that when the people are given the opportunity to articulate the kinds of worldviews and the worlds they inhabit, forms of relational ontology are extremely important. They're made very, very explicit. So I think that's the first thing. There's, in a curious way, the desire to kind of unpeel or disqualify this kind of Occidentric romanticization then led to a curious kind of silencing of the kind of the epistemic richness of what was there in particular forms of indigenous cultures. The second thing, I think, and this is why I can never emphasize enough the difference between forms of communication and forms of translationality, is that what and I've tried to capture this recently, was this notion of translational rift, but you cannot posit some notion of indigeneity as a kind of a pure state that exists prior to transformation and change. In other words, the kind of people that I'm describing, whether it's the Anishinaabemowin speakers that Newton talks about, or the indigenous group in Mexico, the Alabes et al. These people are constantly in a state of translation. The kind of the relationship that they have to the landscape that they inhabit is constantly subject to different kinds of translational pressures. So I think the thing to bear in mind is how, when we're talking or thinking about indigeneity, is that translation is not something that comes after the fact. It's not kind of post factum. It's kind of always already there. It's an inherent part of the kind of the relationality. That's so I think that on both those counts, there is enough evidence to show that it is possible to engage with notions of epistemic difference and relational ontology without succumbing to the kind of essentializing stereotype of the noble savage and its offspring. But thank you for that question, Laura. I think it's very important to kind of to clarify these things, because otherwise it does lead to misunderstanding.
And thanks for the answer. Yes.
Thank you very much. I was caught by this idea of translation as always being there rather than being a post facto event. And and most of it is denied. So it is there, but we tend to constantly deny that it is there and we need it. And this is, in fact, causing the massive, I think also sort of isolation in a way, sort of a self, so we self-submit ourselves to some sort of isolation through the idea of rejecting the very concept of translation being there and being needed all the time. Sorry, it's not really a question. It's just commenting on this very interesting.
Yeah, no. I think that is something that's terribly important. If you look at the history of a lot of the volumes of history on national literatures that were produced or have been produced over the centuries. I mean, it's quite extraordinary the way in which literature is presented as some kind of endogenous internal development in the society. And you might possibly acknowledge some kind of debt to classical antiquity in case of Western literature, but largely it's seen as a kind of endogenous internal growth, whereas whereas literatures themselves are so heavily dependent on translation from elsewhere. I'm also struck by the fact that there is not one single English language or literature course, to my knowledge, in Europe and in North America that teaches the single most important English language text of the 16th century in terms of its influence and consequence, which is Golding's translations of its Metamorphoses in 1567. Huge influence on the evolution of, but no student of English or American literature is going to study Golding's Metamorphoses. So I think this of course is bound up with the notion or the creation of the autonomous or individual self, which we find as part kind of project of modernity, the kind of the cult of autonomous will, where you remove any notion of dependency. You remove a notion of dependency, of debt, of obligation, of relationality, and of course, a critique that's been articulated many occasions in different places by feminist scholars, but you can see how translation fits into that picture. I think there's also a kind of another dimension to this, which is, I always say, that when you go to city of Paris or Rome or Venice and you go and see the famous buildings, the famous museums, or which seem to somehow embody some notion of what constitutes the city's identity. But the things that make the city a city, that make the city work, that make it an actual viable space, are the water that flows through it, the air that envelops it, but it's also the sewage systems, it's the telecommunication systems, it's the electricity networks. But who is going to take a guided tour of the telecommunication networks of Rome, or the internet switching systems in the city of Rome, or Paris, or London? We're not, because to some extent, it's a sense in which mediation itself is sort of unspeakable. That we're in a society that's very often preoccupied with ends. So we want our email message to go instantly from one place to another. But what we're less concerned by or preoccupied with is means, and translation, of course, becomes part of those means. That's why increasingly the kind of image that people have of translation is the Google button. Translate this. You press a button and the translation. But how you get to that translation, how it's constructed, that's not something that we particularly want to know about. And then, of course, with something like simultaneous interpreting, where these disembodied voices seem to arrive from nowhere into our ears, again, it's the kind of, it's the removal of mediation. So that taboo around mediation, I think, is one that affects epistemically translation itself.
Thank you for expanding on that. Thank you very much. I was wondering whether we have some more comment, question, or ideas being inspired by this intriguing talk that really expanded the topic very widely. I was also thinking about our last speaker, Adam Armidson, a sociologist, that was pointing out how we should probably call this era Capitalocene, because we're dominated by capital, and especially by this sort of misinterpretation of what is cheap or what is regarded as cheap, and what has made us devalue, natural resources and that kind of capital that we have not counted in our gross domestic product, and that is now getting scarcer and scarcer. So this idea of labeling very valuable resources as cheap has been clearly a way to deceiving us all into believing that they were limitless. So we've been playing with concept and the relationship we can have with very valuable items, and now we are sort of the victim of our own deception, and again, by denying and sort of wanting to dismiss any mediation. I think we're going back into a loop, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this sort of the notion of the Capitalocene. I mean, that Jason Moore has been putting forward. There's another term which Donna Haraway and others have been using, which is the Plantationocene, that basically the kind of model that's used for capitalist development and environmental destruction is one that originates in colonial exploitation, in the organization of the plantations, and that, so things like sugar, cotton, and so on, these commodities which become the kind of the defining commodities of a particular kind of capitalist development that we have to this day, that they're predicated on the plantation model. And one thing that I've tried to argue in another essay is that basically what we have at that moment is what I call the translational rift. So Marx sort of developed this notion of the metabolic rift that basically, which underlines or underpins this notion of the Capitalocene, is that the things that we produce, the commodities that we produce, that we gradually get kind of removed from the conditions or the environmental consequences of their production and their transformation. So, but it seems to me that if you look at what happens in terms of the establishment of the translation, what happens is you get this kind of very violent removal of populations from one space to another space, who are translatio, who are literally transferred across space, but they're also transferred linguistically. So hence we get the development of Creole languages. Then, of course, we get this massive movement, translation of crops of various kinds and animals, which are brought from one geographical space to another. And then, of course, we get the emergence of monocultures, of forms of mono translation. So it seems to me that this kind of, and we get the material reworking of the landscape through extractivism. The extraction of various metals. So we get a kind of a lithic translation, we get a bio translation, and we get forms of mono translation. So this fundamental kind of disjuncture is basically this kind of translational rift, which and if you think about it, the space of slavery, it's called middle passage. So it's this kind of translational space, and of course it's this translational space that is at the origins, at the genesis of industrialized modernity. It provides the template. So there's a sense in which, when a Caribbean theorist like Malcolm Ferdinand uses, the plantational theme, he's pointing explicitly to these forms of translational rift.
Thanks a lot. Anyone willing to join us in this discussion?
With the post-Easter blues. Everybody feels they should still be on holiday.
I know.
Rather than back at work.
Are we willing to draw to an end, or is there anyone that may be willing to interact but finding it, I don't know, any problem with microphone? You can obviously use the chat if you want to even drop a few lines, and I'll do my best to read and sort of interpret whatever you may want to suggest or discuss. It's gone very quiet. So one last thing I really wish to briefly try to expand with you, if possible, is this very fundamental idea of intersemiotic translation that is again calling into question the idea of media and mediation, and the role played by even the purpose that we may want to achieve by sort of engaging different channels and different sort of material aspect of various languages. And so here I'm talking about also the fact that we're more and more interested into understanding the value of other languages as well, and sort of the language of touch as an affective part that has been denied much attention. But clearly, through these last 2 years, we have understood, how deprived we've been by our physical presence. The idea of being in the same room or in the same sort of space, and so touch has become, that part of the body language that has become almost taboo, because we don't know what to do with touch. I mean, especially as Italian, touching is a bit more common, and touching is also very often like, potentially empathic, potentially, and there's so much meaning. It clearly very often is about closeness and kind of various idea of being friends or being on the same boat, so to speak. So I was wondering whether you could expand a little bit more about, other languages, and also, investigating how, I mean, do we need to listen more? Do we need to retrieve more, even among those languages that we have denied attention? And then all of a sudden we may sort of realize how precious and how valuable they may be in putting us back into a more comfortable and sort of integrated relationship with the environment, and eventually, ourselves as a species, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two dimensions to this, and I think the first is that, I mean, this is going back to the my work in travel writing. One of the things I was kind of interested in was how to think about travel from the point of view of, when we think of traveling to another country, so if I go to Italy, it's a different place, a different language. Then if I spend enough time in Italy, I realize there are different languages within that language and so on. So that's interlingual translation. Then if I go to the United States, I realize the type of English they speak is somewhat different the type of English that I speak. If I go to England, it's the same. The English person comes to Ireland. So that's intralingual translation. So I was interested what happens when British travelers go to the US. Do they write about language? What happens when US travelers go to Britain? Do they write about translational difficulties? And then lastly, I was looking at, this is where I come to your point, is what happens when you go to places and you don't have the language? So what happens? So, and in Roman Jakobson terms, you're in the realm of intersemiotic translation. So how do we use touch then? How do we use gesture? How do we use taste? How do we use smell? In other words, that are many of our senses that are usually deadened by symbolic language become alive as translational media for us. So it's the experience of going to, excuse me, a foreign place then makes one aware of just how reduced most of the time your translational competence actually is. And you're asked to, if you like, develop those translational competencies in that experience of the foreign place in a completely foreign language. And of course, for some people, that's very, very threatening. That's why people often don't go to particular kinds of foreign places, because it's a sense of that kind of disempowerment. There's suddenly the kind of that radical humility. But I think this also applies to, the experience of the pandemic, where, we're used to a world of horizontal travel, so going off to this, that, and the other place, and suddenly we found we were living these locked down, very reduced worlds, and then we had to think about vertical travel. About how do we travel, explore, how do we defamiliarize these terribly familiar places? And one of the things that happened was that a lot of people began to pay attention to trees, to birdsong, to grass, to flowers, to the feeling of the wind, to the strength of sunlight, the appearance of flowers. So it's almost as if this is a situation, the situation of vertical travel, not horizontal, where you're forced to think about other kinds of translational. So what is going on when the birds are singing? What is going on with that tree in my local public park, the one that I can go to within 2 kilometers? So in other words, it's these different languages. It's all of a sudden becoming aware of the fact that multiculturalism, that multilingualism is not something that is restricted to the human species. That it is kind of in the multi-species environments that we inhabit. So it's almost as if one of the things that the pandemic does is to kind of, or it did, was to kind of suggest that we need to think again about those different forms of translational competence.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have the chance to have you with us. It was a pleasure for me, especially, to have this exchange. I really I'm very happy that quite a number of colleagues join us in spite of, yes, being between holidays. And I know that, it's coming up. And on the 25th, as I already anticipated, we have a bank holiday. But yes, Luisa. The microphone is on mute, Luisa.
Well, I just wanted to thank our speaker and you for organizing this. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Luisa. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Best of luck to all of us in these difficult times. And thank you, Michael. And I think we can call it a day. And Loredana and some other people have already left. They had other duties, but thank you everyone for joining us. And a round of applause for Michael. Thank you again.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Hope to be in touch soon.
Absolutely, yeah. Great.
Okay, thank you everyone.